All right, it looks like we are at 10 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to today's workshop. I'm Ashley Green. I'm a project manager in the Brownfields division of EPA's Region 5. I'd like to give a quick thank you to our colleagues in the Office of Brownfields and Land Revitalization for offering us the opportunity to provide this climate training for our municipal, state, and tribal partners. We're glad you are all able to join us today. So we worked with our contractor, ICF, to put together today's workshop, which we hope is an opportunity for everyone to learn more about climate risks and how to screen for them. And then we're also hoping this platform will enable you all to share what you're already doing in regards to climate resiliency in your communities and provide everyone an opportunity to express what future trainings or resources you would like to see from us. So here's a quick overview of our agenda. Today's focus will be on extreme heat and flooding, but we'll also briefly discuss other climate impacts. Some quick housekeeping rules, so please everyone mute your microphones. We have a lot to cover today, so if you can enter questions into the chat box, we'll be answering throughout the workshop. And finally, we'll be recording the session, so we'll be emailing out the recording as well as the slides following the completion of the workshop, and then we'll also be posting it on our website. So as I mentioned before, I'm Ashley Green. I'm a Brownfields project manager in EPA Region 5. Previously, I worked for the state of Massachusetts, working with communities on increasing their resiliency to climate change through better stormwater management practices. And I've also been a municipal project manager and managed capital projects that focused on climate mitigation and adaptation. Next, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Sarah Gruza, to introduce herself.
Thanks, Ashley. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Again, my name is Sarah Gruza. I'm a Brownfields project manager as well. I've been with the EPA for about 2.5 years now. In addition to that role, I am the climate adaptation lead for Region 5's Land, Chemicals, and Redevelopment Division. We would like to thank our headquarter office, again, Office of Brownfields and Land Revitalization, for allowing us the opportunity to work with the very talented ICF team who will be facilitating today's workshop. Today, we have Brenda Dix, Amanda Vargo, and Emily Blanton. Brenda and Amanda help local, state, and federal agencies assess and prepare for climate risks. Emily supports our headquarters office, OBLR, in providing technical assistance to communities impacted by brownfields. So 2 areas of expertise coming together. We're very excited. And last, but certainly not least on our list of introductions, is our keynote speaker, Dr. Joel Sharaga. Dr. Sharaga is the Senior Advisor for Climate Adaptation in the Office of Policy within the Office of the Administrator at the US Environmental Protection Agency. He leads the EPA's work on climate adaptation to ensure the agency continues to fulfill its mission on protecting human health and the environment, even as the climate changes. A central focus of this effort is supporting states, tribes, territories, local communities, and businesses as they prepare for and increase their resilience to the impacts of climate change, emphasizing the focus on advancing environmental justice. Dr. Sharaga led the team that developed the EPA's new Climate Adaptation Action Plan. Hopefully you've heard about it. A few fun facts about Dr. Sharaga. In December of 2015, he was honored with the Presidential Rank Award, the highest honor given to career members of the Federal Senior Executive Service. Also, Dr. Sharaga was the lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which was awarded the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize. Without further ado, Dr. Sharaga, the mic is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for that very kind introduction, and good morning, everybody. It's a real pleasure for me to be with you today at the outset of this training workshop. But before I begin, I do want to thank Sarah and Ashley Green, who you just met, and Kate Balassa, who's our climate adaptation lead in Region 5, for all of their hard work that's gone on behind the scenes, along with the team from ICF, to pull this a training workshop together. A huge amount of effort has gone into it and into the planning and organization of the workshop. So thank you to all of you from here at EPA headquarters. So jumping into it, EPA Region 5 has for many years been on the forefront of EPA's efforts to work with communities in the Midwest and in Canada to anticipate, prepare for, and adapt to the impacts of climate change. And there are many examples. The Great Lakes Restoration Initiative and the work that Region 5 has been doing through the initiative for over 2 decades is just one of those examples. Now, the training workshop today is another example of the leadership role Region 5 is playing. This training workshop is a model for what Brownfields offices in other EPA offices, along with their stakeholders in communities across the regions, may want to consider doing. So I applaud all of you for being here today. Now, I recognize that many of you, both inside and outside EPA, have probably never even thought about why climate change matters for brownfields revitalization and redevelopment efforts. And to be quite candid, some of you may even be thinking of climate change as another environmental issue unrelated to brownfields cleanup efforts. So right at the outset, I want to emphasize that this isn't about dealing with climate change simply because it's another administration priority that appears unrelated to what you do on a day-to-day basis. Rather, it's about ensuring that all of us working together can continue to make investments that effectively revitalize and redevelop brownfields sites in a world in which the climate is changing, in a world in which the risk posed by climate change, things like more extreme storms and flooding events that we're seeing, can undermine your investment efforts. And we want to make sure at EPA that our brownfields grantees, along with the recipients of technical assistance that we provide to states, tribes, and municipalities, are empowered to ensure that the outcomes of investments in brownfields revitalization and redevelopment efforts are resilient to climate impacts now and in the future. Now, I want to put this very quickly into a larger context. As I'm sure everybody knows, the Biden-Harris administration has made it a priority to confront the climate crisis while at the same time advancing environmental justice. The impacts of climate change are affecting people in every region of the country, threatening lives and livelihoods and damaging infrastructure, ecosystems, and social systems in communities all across the nation, not just in Region 5. And it's heartbreaking when you think about all the flooding events and hurricanes and wildfires that we've seen just in the past couple of years and the impacts it's had on people's lives. Now, the priority placed by President Biden on addressing these sorts of impacts, which are increasingly occurring, is in fact reflected in EPA's new strategic plan, which for the first time in EPA's history has a goal focused on climate change. And it's also reflected in EPA's new climate adaptation plan, which Sarah alluded to. But it's also reflected in Region 5's climate adaptation implementation plan, which was published in October. And I encourage all of you, if you haven't already done so, to take a look at that plan, which is beautifully done, because it identifies the vulnerabilities of the region's programs, like the Brownfields program, to the impacts of climate change, and identifies the priority actions that Region 5 will take to address those vulnerabilities and is already taking actions like this training workshop. Now, it's fortuitous that this training workshop is taking place in Region 5. You are the home to the Great Lakes, which has invaluable natural resources. You're also at the epicenter of some significant climate impacts, which pose risk to your communities, to public health, and to the environment. Now, having said that, I don't want this to sound like doom and gloom. Having said that, our Region 5 office, along with our partners in the states, tribes, and municipalities, are uniquely positioned to work together to increase the resilience of the region to the impacts of climate change. And I want to emphasize again that we at EPA can't do this alone. As Administrator Michael Regan has said in the past, we want to consult and partner with states, tribes, local governments, businesses, as well as other federal agencies to strengthen adaptive capacity, your adaptive capacity, and increase the resilience of the region with a particular focus on environmental justice. And before I finish, I really wanted drill down into that issue of environmental justice. For those of you working on climate resilience and brownfields issues, the focus on EJ is essential. It's absolutely essential because very often those communities and individuals most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change live at or near brownfield sites. So it's imperative that as we adapt to a changing climate, we ensure that we've got a focus on those EJ communities, a focus on the most vulnerable communities. But again, Region 5 has been a leader, and I'm thrilled to say that we're not starting from scratch, at least in Region 5. Now, there's so many examples. I'll just give you two because the proof is always in the details. One example, since 2003, the Redevelopment Authority of the City of Milwaukee has received 23 brownfields grants from Region 5. Two groups in Milwaukee currently have environmental justice small grants and are working in neighborhoods where residents are disproportionately affected by climate impacts. Just one example. So they're increasing their resilience to climate change while at the same time ensuring that the most vulnerable are protected. One other example, in the city of Cincinnati, the city and its development authority have received 7 brownfields grants going all the way back to 1997. And one notable project is the Lick Run Greenway in the South Fairmont neighborhood, where almost half of residents live in poverty. They are particularly and disproportionately at risk from climate change. And the evidence shows that during heavy rainstorms, like those that are happening with more intensity and more often as a result of climate change, the sewer system in that community overflows and spills contaminated water into local streams. But now, as a result of the investments made by EPA, the Greenway now diverts 900 million tons of overflow annually and features a park, walkway, cultural trail, sports areas, and more. So to wrap up, I want to emphasize we're not starting from scratch in Region 5, and I'm so proud to be able to highlight what Region 5 has done. But at the same time, there's still so much to do, but so many opportunities to take advantage of. And today's training workshop is an important step towards pursuing those opportunities. It is beautifully designed. And again, credit goes to Sarah and Ashley and the rest of the team. It is beautifully designed to help you understand the risk posed by climate change to brownfields revitalization and redevelopment efforts, and the opportunities and mechanisms for adapting to these risks to increase resilience to climate change while advancing environmental justice. So I just welcome all of you and I applaud all of you for taking time out of your busy schedules to participate today. And with that, I'll stop. And Brenda, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you all for being here.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Schrager, for that excellent introduction. I really enjoyed it. Okay. Now we want to know a little bit about who all of you are on the line today, now that you know a little bit about us. So we have this interactive mural board that we'll be using throughout the training today. You can see the link here on the slide. Also, Darcy just dropped it into the chat. It does work best in Chrome. However, it will work in other browsers. So if you could all just click on that and start to enter the board, I would appreciate it. We'll give it just a moment and then we'll talk a little bit about how this works. All right, so we're now showing in the team site what you would be seeing once you click on the link. And you can zoom in using the scroll bar on your mouse or sort of the touchscreen-like capabilities on your trackpad if you're using your laptop. So some of this tech stuff at the beginning while you're getting in here, you're showing up as an avatar. So that's just a note. Please speak up and ask for help if you need that, either through the chat functionality in Teams or just unmuting. We're happy to help. You can also email Darcy, whose contact information was on one of the earlier slides. But what we're going to ask you to do is go down to this introduction section with a lot of yellow stickies. Zoom in until you can see it. And how this works, you just double click in one of them. And you can type in your name. You can type in your role right before that, or below that, excuse me. And then the third one in the stack is, how have you already seen climate change affecting the region? Dr. Schrager gave some great examples, but we want to hear from you what your experiences have been as well. When you're done, you can just click in the white space and then you're out of the sticky. So I see a lot of typing. I'm happy to see that. Give it a little more time as people get in here and get oriented to the system. All right, in terms of impacts, we're seeing some comments coming in about, flooding, plowing frequency, stormwater management, increased temperatures, urban heat island effects. We'll be talking more about that. Generally more extreme weather. Different biodiversity and warmer winters. Some issues along the shoreline. Mass extinctions. This is great. I love the direction that you're thinking, and it's good to be sharing what you're seeing on the ground today. Okay. So keep that tab in your browser open. Like I said, we're going to be coming back to it. It's great to see a lot of people in the board and using it, so I appreciate that. I don't see any technical challenges showing up in the chat, but feel free to put them in there if you have questions or if you're having any issues at all. So we're going to switch back to the PowerPoint in the team setting just for a little bit. Like I said, before going back to the Mural board, and I'm going to be giving a little bit of an overview of climate change impacts to brownfield sites. So, starting at the most basic, what are the risks to brownfields from climate change? That's really the heart of this presentation today, but it's really important to be considering those risks as you're going through the redevelopment process to be sure that you're reducing these impacts and that you're supporting the local and regional climate resilience. Like Dr. Schrager said, there's a lot going on in this region, and we want to see that alignment and working together to solve some of these issues. And in order to understand what you should be considering during that redevelopment process, you really need to start with understanding what are the risks at your site. And so that's what we're going to be helping you with today, is pointing out tools and resources that will help you with that process. So as a really quick snapshot at the highest level, how is our climate changing? Just like a lot of you said in the Mural board, we are seeing increasing heavy precipitation and floods. This graphic here is showing you historically just changes between 1958 and 2012. So you can see that 37% increase in this region for a very heavy precipitation, which leads to those extreme flooding events. We're also projected to see more extreme heat waves. Oh, I'm getting some comments that you're not seeing my slides advancing. Let me see if I can sort that out. My apologies for the technical challenges. I'm gonna stop sharing. And Eva, could you pull up the deck one more time and we'll work from there? Okay, can I get a thumbs up if you all see the brownfields and climate change slide? All right, a lot of thumbs up. Good. I'm glad we solved whatever was happening there. All right. So now that you can see this graphic that I was talking to about how the climate is changing. So like I said, the increasing heavy precipitation and floods in the left-hand panel there between 1958 and 2012. In the middle panel, we'll be seeing more extreme heat waves. This is more of a forward-looking projection that you're seeing here, but it's essentially showing you, temperatures that are 10 to 15 degrees hotter under the worst case sort of scenario in 2100 relative to the temperatures you've experienced in the past. So temperatures are going to be getting a lot hotter on those extreme heat days. Now, obviously less relevant to this region, but important to point out, we obviously are seeing continued sea level rise and coastal flooding for states where that is relevant. All right, so climate impacts to brownfield sites and communities. Today, we're really going to be focusing on the first two on this slide, the heat and flooding portion, but I'm going to quickly just touch on drought, lake effect snow, and wildfire, since obviously those are also considerations in this region. For heat, we'll go a lot deeper in this in the future upcoming slides, but you're seeing average annual temperatures are increasing, as well as those more extreme events like heat waves, both in length and frequency. And also extreme heat events can worsen the urban heat island effect. If you don't know what that is, I'll be touching more about that, but that poses a serious risk to our communities, and more of our disadvantaged communities are vulnerable to those urban heat island impacts and more likely to live in locations where that is a relevant concern. For flooding, we're seeing increases in the frequency and magnitude of heavy precipitation events, which can increase flooding. And in terms of that connection with your brownfield slides, obviously those flood events can damage essential infrastructure and cause contaminants to spread. Drought is a harder one to understand. It's a very complex event that's combining multiple climate and weather related variables, right? It's about precipitation, it's about temperatures, it's about a series of different things working together. So there is some uncertainty about future drought behavior in the Midwest, but regional trends generally suggest wetter conditions and fewer droughts moving forward. However, there will be greater oscillations between dry periods and flood events. So sort of that whiplash effect that you may have heard before of going from dry conditions to very stormy conditions. When you do have droughts, those can impact the vegetation at your brownfield sites, which you might be relying on for erosion control, flooding reduction, et cetera. In terms of lake effect snow, many of you are very familiar with this phenomenon. It's also a little uncertain of what's going to happen in the future, but this basically happens right when you have an unfrozen lake surface that allows for evaporation to fuel snow and precipitation falling just adjacent. And what we're seeing in the climate science projections that as the warming in the Midwest continues, you'll see less lake ice, which allows for that lake effect snow to happen more frequently. However, at some point where we'll likely reach a tipping point where then the winters become so warm that that snowfall will shift to rain. So in the interim time period, let's say the next 20 to 30 years, you may be experiencing an increase in that lake effect snow. Once you look out more towards the end of the century, it's likely you're going to be getting a lot more rain, which obviously has other implications in terms of flooding and such. Wildfire, obviously this is a major concern more out west. We're seeing a lot of increased incidence of wildfires, both in frequency, extent, and everything else. And in this region, you are seeing longer seasons and larger burned areas. By mid-century, projections estimate that the number of extreme fire danger days during summer will increase by 1 to 6 days and potentially up to 10 days. It's not a massive increase, but it is notable, right, that this might be becoming more of an issue and is something to keep an eye on moving forward, because wildfires can spread toxic contaminants from your brownfield sites, and that poses major health implications to surrounding communities. So how can brownfield redevelopment support community resilience? We talked about this nexus earlier. To start with, resilience is really the capability to anticipate, prepare for, respond to, and recover from significant multi-hazard threats with minimum damage to social well-being, the economy, and the environment. That's what we're striving for when we're talking about addressing climate change in the redevelopment process. And that's important because it can help minimize brownfield cleanup and redevelopment vulnerabilities to climate change, but it also supports members of vulnerable populations that live close to brownfields, and brownfield redevelopment creates an opportunity to improve the quality of life for those populations and help make the site, as well as those surrounding communities, more resilient to the impacts of climate change. There's also significant financial reasons to consider climate change during brownfield redevelopment. We've all seen that there's an increasing frequency of extreme weather events that are having major financial implications throughout the US. In 2021, there were 20 weather and climate disasters that cost at least $1 billion. And leaving a brownfield site unprotected from future climate can lead to impacts in terms of increased and repeated damage over time, higher maintenance and insurance costs, and negative human health and environmental impacts. So, an extra dollar up front could save you a lot of money down the road. It's a good long-term investment. And the benefits are more than just financial. You also see increases in community resilience through more resilient infrastructure and reliable service, potential increases in property values, which would attract additional green investments, environmental benefits like stormwater management, water quality, air quality, and wildlife habitats, and community benefits in terms of improved public health and safety, increased recreation space, green jobs, and environmental justice. So there's a lot of really good co-benefits and reasons to be thinking about climate impacts and climate resilience, in particular during brownfield redevelopment. I'm going to touch on this briefly. Dr. Schraga also mentioned this, that climate change does have a significant disproportionate effect on disadvantaged communities who have the least capacity to prepare and recover from climate-related events. And that brownfield redevelopment can support environmental justice initiatives. The Justice 40 initiative created by the Biden-Harris administration to confront and address the history of underinvestment in disadvantaged communities is really something that EPA is supporting. You can see that in some of their brownfield grant competition. For example, 86% of the communities selected for funding in 2022 are in historically underserved areas. So if you want to understand better what is the overlap between disadvantaged communities in the region in which I'm working and brownfield sites, or anything else that you're working on, you could use some of the tools listed at the bottom of the screen, like the Justice 40 Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool, the EJ Screen, and Enviro Atlas. So those are all sort of map-based geospatial resources to help unpack this and help you have more insights into these considerations. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tiffany.
Hello, everyone. My name is Tiffany Harvey. I am the GIS and Operations Director for Groundwork Ohio River Valley. And today I am going to share with you how we engage residents of vulnerable communities to climate change impacts and a program called Climate Safe Neighborhoods. And also I'm going to touch on how we use GIS to inform our programming. Sorry about that. Groundwork Ohio River Valley serves the greater Cincinnati area. We are working primarily in the urban environment, trying to restore the built environment of urban areas. And in the process, we're also trying to reach people that are typically left behind by environmental movements. And those include people of low income status, people of color, and people in the urban environment in general. Groundwork Ohio River Valley is a part of a national network of 25 different trusts, and all of them engage in similar work. Our three main programs are Climate Safe Neighborhoods, Green Workforce Development, and Citizen Science. Today I'm going to focus on our Climate Safe Neighborhoods program. So Climate Safe Neighborhoods is our largest program that we have. It involves first identifying neighborhoods within Cincinnati and also in northern Kentucky, which are more vulnerable to climate change impacts. So these are neighborhoods that have higher populations of low-income people, higher populations of people of color, and neighborhoods that have been subjected to institutionalized racism through different historical events and policies over time. So our goal with the Climate Safe Neighborhoods program is to engage the residents of these neighborhoods in climate resiliency planning. We are trying to use data that we have, GIS data, along with the lived experience of the people who live in these neighborhoods to figure out how we can work together to prepare for climate change and adapt to it. So our program involves first identifying the vulnerable neighborhoods, and we start this by using geospatial data. So usually this involves looking at historical data that we have related to redlining or housing segregation and also industrial zoning. And we also rely on the EPA's EJ screen tool quite a bit to identify these neighborhoods as well. After we have identified the neighborhoods that we want to do this programming in, we carry out a climate advisory group, and this involves meetings during which residents are paid to attend, which I think is a very important part of the programming, that we're paying residents to participate. Basically the first part of our programming involves educating the residents about how climate change is impacting their neighborhood and why they are more vulnerable to different climate impacts based on the government and institutionalized racism that happened to them over the years. After that, we work with them to create a climate resiliency plan, which I will go into more detail about in a few slides. And then the final part of our CSN programming is the actual implementation of adaptation strategies that are recommended by residents. And usually that includes tree plantings, but it can also include like community garden projects and green roofs, and we have a bunch of other things as well. But tree planting is the main thing that we do because it's attainable, it's easy to do, it's wonderful for getting residents and volunteers involved doing something hands-on. Like I mentioned before, GIS is very important to the work that we're doing. We start again by looking at the historical data that we have that indicates the neighborhoods that have been discriminated against in the past. For example, the map that you're seeing here to the left shows urban renewal, which happened in 1948. And this had a major impact on which neighborhoods became more vulnerable to climate change, because urban renewal involved clearing a lot of housing. And most of the housing that was cleared, that was considered to be slums, was primarily housing that had populations of African Americans, and the housing that was replaced was segregated housing, and there was not enough housing for African Americans after that happened. Additionally, there was a lot of housing loan discrimination throughout the years. There were even some real estate agents that would refuse to sell homes to Black people, and also there was a lot of block busting that was happening, and there's a lot of evidence of that as well. And if you look at historical industrial zoning, most of it is occurring in predominantly Black neighborhoods. Again, we use the EPA's EJ screen tool quite a bit for our understanding which neighborhoods we should be targeting for our programming. It's an incredibly useful tool, which I really highly recommend that everybody use who's like working and doing similar work in communities. All you have to do is just click on the census blocks of the neighborhood that you're looking at, and you will get a report that shows you the percentile of ozone and particulate matter and their air toxic cancer risk. It's really useful for understanding which neighborhoods are very vulnerable. So our climate advisory group, I'm going to go into more detail about it here. Basically, we go out into the neighborhood that we have identified as being vulnerable, and we recruit the residents of that neighborhood, and we pay them to attend meetings. And usually we have 6 meetings that occur, and during that time we're working on informing the residents about how they're being impacted by climate change. And then we work on creating a climate resiliency plan, which involves them telling us what observations they're seeing, and then giving us adaptation recommendations. And they do that through mapping activities that we have. So the first mapping activity is where they identify the observations that they're seeing related to climate change. Landslides are a big issue here that we face, so that's one of the things that we see frequently, but there's a bunch of other ones too. And then after they've done that activity, they do a mapping activity where they identify areas where they would like to see climate adaptation recommendations as well. Here's an example of some work that one of our residents did in South Cummingsville. You can see where they've identified some climate impacts and some climate adaptations that they would like to see. So after I receive all the map activities from all the residents, I aggregate all of those into a map that shows community observations, and then a map that shows their adaptation recommendations, which is their climate resiliency plan. And we take these 2 maps and we try to use it to gain support for projects that we would like to partner with the community on. And we use it, generally for like educational purposes and stuff like that. And at the end of all of these climate advisory groups, we have a story map, which is basically a report that's more interactive than a normal report. And I don't have time to show it, but you can definitely like explore it. Sometime it's on our website. And then ongoing GIS is really important to our CSN program too. We are trying to make the data like the EJ screen data more digestible and easy to understand for community residents and officials and other people who want to look into the condition of their neighborhood and like what impacts they might be seeing. And our ultimate goal is to try to combine the EJ screen data with community members' lived experiences, which we think are really valuable. And an ongoing thing that we're trying to implement is more brownfield education. We have noticed that a lot of our community members are really concerned about brownfields. It was mentioned earlier that a lot of these vulnerable neighborhoods also have brownfields, and that has been very true in my experience. We frequently work with communities that are very concerned about brownfields, and we have to think about that whenever we're working on our climate resiliency plans. Yeah. And with that, I will pass it off to Emily and Sarah.
Great. Thanks so much, Tiffany. So we'll discuss a little bit now about the ways to incorporate climate resiliency within the context of brownfield redevelopment and some of the resources that are available for you guys. So when we're talking about sort of how to integrate these sustainable and resilient choices into your work, luckily enough, EPA has published a very handy manual that discusses this very topic. So the Climate Smart Brownfields Manual was published back in June of 2021, and this walks through the various techniques for incorporating climate into decisions throughout the brownfields process, from planning and assessment through cleanup and redevelopment. So there are about two main goals of this manual. First, to help communities specifically consider climate throughout their process, and then, the tools and techniques are geared towards them, but also to provide references and tools for practitioners such as yourself at EPA and other partner organizations and the larger brownfield community to use. So I'll say it's full of great data, more about why we should be considering this aspect in brownfields, as Brenda talked about earlier, as well as some case studies and other examples. So definitely take a look in the training, after this training, and use it as a handy reference guide as you work through projects with your partners. So I won't be going through sort of all of the manual, certainly not with the time we have today, but I do want to give an overview of sort of the types of strategies that can be used at each of these stages in the process. And all of this is included in Appendix A of the manual, so you have a reference to go back to after the training. But starting just at the beginning, the part one that focuses on planning work really does sort of set the stage for successful brownfield redevelopment, as you guys all know. Many of these strategies here are not specifically something that EPA brownfields project officers may take on, but it could be helpful to review with your local and state partners periodically, as well as during the application period for certain grants, and encourage them to update local regulations or hazard mitigation plans and keep those ordinances and codes up to date. And that way, when you get down to the redevelopment process on a site, the framework for climate smart buildings and sites and redevelopment is already established and is an expected outcome by the community and by the locality. And it becomes much more integrated into the planning work that goes on at the larger scale across the city. So the next one focuses on assessment, and this may be where we're all a little bit more comfortable within the brownfields process. But when it comes to assessing the site, obviously phase 1 and phase 2 environmental site assessments are important in any of these brownfield projects. But these types of reports and other environmental assessments can be oriented with a focus on climate. So for example, when you get to the investigation of site history under an ESA, this could include a study of a site's vulnerabilities to climate events currently, in the past and into the future as those trends intensify. So it's something to include in those ESAs that discuss the climate vulnerabilities on the site. Similarly, if an ABCA, the analysis of brownfield cleanup alternatives, is necessary on the site, this is also a really great opportunity to evaluate resilience of remedial options in the face of climate changing on your site. So for example, increased flooding, as Brenda talked about earlier at the site, perhaps may compromise a remedial approach such as, an engineered cap and impact the long-term effectiveness of that cap. So those considerations should certainly be taken into account and discussed in the APCA when you're reviewing options for site cleanup. So next slide then gets into the demolition phase, which is not probably necessary on all the sites that you may work with, but it could be a big part of your project. So these strategies here focus on mitigation, obviously, of climate impacts from demolition rather than adaptation, because you're getting rid of a building or a structure rather than adapting it. But anyways, demolition on a site can obviously result in significant amounts of landfill debris, moving and removing of contaminants that cross over property lines and heavy equipment that may release greenhouse gases during operations. So deconstruction is one of those methods that's described here as a strategy as a way to recover some of those reusable materials, bricks or other structural elements, to divert waste away from landfills. And this can also sort of maintain the site's history as well as identity. So community members recognize the site if those materials are reused for any future redevelopment. So there's several existing programs and tools that are called out in the manual, provide successful demolition programs. There's also other EPA regions that are tackling this deconstruction issue, so definitely reach out to other folks for their experiences within the Region 5 context, but also outside for their experiences with different sites and different programs. So the next would just be the cleanup, another familiar part of the brownfields process. Several strategies here that are called out in the manual can be implemented during this stage to sort of modify or improve climate outcomes. So the EPA across several different departments, Superfund, as well as others within brownfields, the ATSM and other organizations have produced several different documents and guides on how to implement greener cleanups. But these strategies here in the manual really focus on a few key strategies, such as reducing environmental impacts by limiting contaminant removal off-site, so remediating what you can on-site, reducing waste generation and materials like we talked about under demolition, reusing or using renewable energy to power remediation activities and others. So as you work through your work plans with brownfield partners and grantees, there are instances where you may be able to suggest some of these strategies during the cleanup phase. So think about ways to start discussing those options and types of interventions with your partners. So finally, there are several ways to incorporate climate resiliency when you get to the redevelopment stage. These are likely to be the strategies that seem more obvious or that you recognize as climate-friendly approaches, such as green infrastructure on site that helps mitigate or adapt to increasing stormwater, green roofs, climate-friendly buildings, that sort of thing. Other strategies may be less recognizable as climate-friendly approaches to redevelopment, but including something like a multimodal transit stop can play a huge role in reducing both the individual vehicle miles travel, VMTs, that is a major environmental benefit of brownfields, but also the greenhouse gas emissions from individual travel. So there are just specific ways to sort of approach that when you get to redevelopment and connecting it back to the planning side, where some of the codes, zoning, and ordinances at the local scale can really help make the case for incorporating these types of attributes when you get to redevelopment. So finally, in addition to the Climate Smart Brownfields Manual, I just wanted to highlight quickly another resource that can be utilized by EPA staff to support climate resiliency planning on brownfield sites. So the Regionally Directed Technical Assistance Program is administered at the headquarters level, but it's directed by the regions. And this can really help support communities that are planning for redevelopment across a myriad of different types of brownfield sites. So this is just one example that Sarah, Jim Vanderkloot, and I have been working on in Ashland, Wisconsin. So this site was a former railroad trestle connected to an ore dock that goes out into the Lake Superior shoreline. So the city of Ashland was gifted the land by the railroad company, and the phase 2 found significant contamination related to the treated wood that was used in the trestle, different fueling activities, as well as rail maintenance, all of the wonderful things that you can imagine that come with a railroad property. And so the climate also along Lake Superior has changed and is continuing to change into the future, including increased storm activity and higher water levels in the lake, more erosion from stronger storms, and additional stormwater runoff that it brings up the issue of contaminants moving offsite into the lake. So under this RDTA project, we're working on a conceptual redevelopment plan that would activate the upland area that you see with some of the buildings on the former trestle and connect that upward area to a wonderful redevelopment that's already occurred on the ore dock. It's a public park that's stunning and is really great opportunity to get out into the lake, but want to knit together these pieces to provide some economic opportunities as well as environmental protection for the shoreline. So we're utilizing a living shoreline here, which is a combination of both gray and green infrastructure to protect that shoreline habitat. And you can see that mostly in the green sections right next to the ore dock. So that helps to protect that habitat, but also to stabilize some of the banks from the increased storm activity and reduce some of the wave erosion that's occurring. There's also some plans for some stormwater management techniques farther away from the shoreline and the upwards area just to protect some of that runoff. So this is an ongoing project under the RDTA program that could look at some other climate strategies on this site, but gives you an idea of some of the resources or ways that we're thinking about climate impacts on our sites. So Sarah, is there anything else that you want to add to that example?
Yes, really quick, just for further context, kind of looking at a broader picture here. During the initial stages of meeting with the City of Ashland and the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, our state partners, we looked at not only their brownfields challenges and their revitalization goals, but we were also looking to see where they were at with their climate resiliency goals and their climate adaptation planning. So to be able to incorporate that aspect of their priorities locally and looking at EPA priorities of tackling the climate crisis per the Biden administration's executive order, we were thrilled to be able to come to this kind of conclusion for this site reuse design. So incorporating climate smart solutions for communities like Ashland is just one example of many of how brownfields redevelopment is playing a role in equipping communities to better prepare for and respond to events related to climate change.
Thanks, Sarah. So now I'll hand it back over to Brenda to take us through another section.
Thank you. Okay. Sorry about that. All right, now get ready for this deeper dive into extreme heat and some of the resources available. So stepping back a little bit, again, about extreme heat risk to brownfield sites. What you're really seeing in terms of potential impacts is the vegetation stress, the decreased water availability, and the potential for increased drought and wildfire. And just as important, if not more so, the extreme heat risk to your communities, right, are really about heat-related illness and death, as well as reduced air and water quality. Heat is the #1 extreme weather event killer in the United States and internationally. And so it is a major concern. We usually think about the flashier events like flooding and things of that nature, but heat can be a real issue. So just a couple more looks at how temperatures are changing. On the left, you see another map about the rate of temperature change in the United States historically. And so what you can see here is that we are seeing several degrees of warming over time between 1901 and 2021 in the region. And on the right-hand side, you're seeing an increase in the frequency and length of extreme heat waves. And so that's having major implications for human health because you don't have the time and infrastructure time to cool down overnight to really get that relief. It compounds itself as those heat waves move on. So both global average and extreme temperatures are projected to increase by 2050. So all of this will be getting worse, with heat waves becoming longer, more frequent, and more severe. And as I mentioned before, there are other contributors to extreme heat other than climate change. And this is where that nexus is between things that we can change at a site level moving forward. So increased urbanization and impervious surfaces really exacerbates that extreme heat. The excess heat that's emitted by buildings, roads, and other infrastructure is the problem, right? You've all been around the heat radiating off of an asphalt road. It does feel much warmer in that location. And it's also a problem overnight where all of those surfaces that have absorbed heat during the day continue to radiate that heat in the evening as well. And like I said, doesn't allow that ability to cool down overnight. This is also made worse in areas with a lack of tree cover and green space. And that's especially a problem in disadvantaged communities. You know, you see it a lot of just a lack of green space, lack of trees in these densely populated disadvantaged locations. Increased humidity can also exacerbate these extreme heat concerns because it makes the feel-like or real field temperature higher. And the frequency and magnitude of high humidity events are expected to increase with climate change as well. So when you combine all of those impacts, right, the rising temperatures, the rising humidity, the changes in the urban landscape, that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about the urban heat island effect, as those elements come together. And this is really nicely demonstrated, I think, in this graphic on the right-hand side that's showing you that daytime temperatures in urban heat islands are about 1 to 7 degrees higher than temperatures in the outlying areas. So the worst in sort of those downtown, really developed areas, but you still see those types of impacts, though, to a lesser degree in commercial and suburban residential or urban residential areas. And that nighttime temperatures, like I was saying, can be 2 to 5 degrees higher, so a little bit more of an impact on that side of the equation. So if you want to better understand this in the area that you work, what are the resources for you to take a look at how temperature is changing, how it's projected to change moving forward? How can you do that zoom in, basically, to the areas that you care about? Heat.gov is a really great resource. It's a web portal for the National Integrated Heat Health Information System, and that's going to give you both current conditions in terms of risks. So it can tell you, you know, today there's higher heat in certain locations, as well as that future outlook looking out to 2050-ish timeframe for a variety of different heat indicators. And it also provides a collection of other tools and products, including resources you can use on urban heat island and planning and preparing for those extreme heat events. But we recognize that there's limitations to what we can do in terms of modeling at a national scale. While heat.gov allows you to zoom in, like I said, it won't necessarily, the modeling isn't refined enough to capture all of those urban heat island type of effects, those really localized considerations and issues. And so they offer resources that I encourage you to take advantage of to better understand the urban heat island concerns and impacts in your communities. And that's through their urban heat island mapping campaign. On the right-hand side on this map, you can see locations that have already taken advantage of this resource. You know, some in this region as well, which is fantastic to see. But if where you're located isn't showing up on there, you know, you could work with the community to maybe apply to be part of that next mapping campaign. And one thing that's nice about this is it uses really a citizen science approach. And so you get to get the community involved, you get to get them out there with thermometers, measuring temperatures throughout the community on a day or two. And so then the question of, you know, what can you do about these issues? And these are really what's shown on this slide, you know, best management practices. You might do this because of extreme heat and the fact that it's getting worse, but they're good for even today, right? We have extreme heat that happens on a regular basis. And so it's important to be considering these, whether you're in a highly urbanized area or not, whether you're in an area that's projected to get hotter in the future or not. They're just good best management practices for managing any day with extreme temperatures. And so it's things like reducing the amount of pavement on a site, using lighter colored materials, incorporating creative shade and heat mitigation, using green infrastructure like green roofs, rain gardens, and bioswales, planting more native tree species and other vegetation, ideally ones that are also heat and drought tolerant, and establishing cooling centers. So now we're going to flip back to that mural board to give you all an opportunity to think through and talk about what are strategies you could use to reduce these heat impacts and what are ones that you're already using. So Darcy just replaced the link in the chat in case you close that browser. If not, head back over to it. And the activity is really taking a look at these pictures that we have in this extreme heat section, this sort of old brick warehouse, and then one below that, more focused on sort of your urban or suburban strip mall situation. And what we're asking is that you double click in those purple stickies for those two sites to type in ideas of what are strategies you could use in this type of location to reduce those heat impacts. And we also want to encourage you to read what the other people involved in this training are typing in. And you can use those green check marks, just click and drag them if there's any strategies that you're already using or that you think is a particularly good idea. We'll leave a little time for you all to type in there. Hopefully this feels like a good exercise to get your creative juices flowing, to maybe also reflect about sites that you're involved in one way or another and what you might be doing at those locations as well, or could be suggesting as potential considerations in those locations. Also, if you had questions about anything that I presented or Emily or Tiffany presented, please feel free to put those in the chat as well, and we can circle back and answer anything. Seeing some great ideas in here, like using light colored and reflective materials, creating a green roof, putting in more shade, whether that's through trees or other approaches. Replacing the pavement with flower beds. There's certainly a lot of pavement in these pictures. Putting tree plantings in the parking lots and medians between parking lanes with plants. Adding awnings for more dedicated sun coverage. These are good. Keep them coming. Give it just another minute or two for people to get in their thoughts, and then we'll move on to the next portion of the agenda. And if anyone's having trouble with Mural, you can also just put your ideas in the Teams chat and we can translate them over if need be. I like this one that says pervious pavements with some fun vegetation in between paved areas. This should be fun, right? It creates a more interesting, exciting environment in addition to having these co-benefits for heat mitigation. Adding water features such as splash pads and shallow pools. That's one we didn't have on the prior slides. That's a great idea. All right. Feel free to keep typing in there, but I think on this main screen in Teams, we're going to switch back and move on to the next portion of the presentation.
Okay, so we are now going to deep dive into flooding. There we go. So unsurprisingly, and I'm sure you all are very familiar with flooding impacts, flooding does pose some pretty serious threats to brownfield sites as well as the surrounding community, such as compromised drinking water quality, stormwater overflows, spreading of contaminants, and damage to critical infrastructure, whether that's at the site or critical infrastructure within the community. And there are 3 major contributors to flooding that we want to cover today: increased precipitation, impervious surface area like pavement, and development within floodplains. So as we mentioned in the beginning of the training, extreme precipitation events are increasing in frequency and intensity in the Midwest region. And this is due in part to rising temperatures. Warmer air has the ability to hold more water, so that contributes to increased precipitation. And the map on the right here is showing us the change in the number of days per year with very heavy precipitation by mid-century. And so Ohio, much of Ohio and northern Michigan are expected to see the greatest change there in the increase of heavy precipitation days, but we're seeing a degree of change throughout the entire region. And precipitation patterns are also becoming more variable. So while the total precipitation falling over the course of the year might largely be the same, the delivery of that precipitation is changing. So as Brenda mentioned earlier, we're seeing more heavy rainfall events then punctuated by a longer dry spell. And so that shift in sort of how the precipitation is falling is really a large contributor to this increased risk of flooding. Next is increasing impervious surface area. So when development occurs, the natural landscape and vegetation are replaced by highways, parking lots, that sort of thing, which those surface areas are not able to absorb or filter water like a natural land cover was able to. And so that causes runoff and again contributes to increased flood risk. And then related to impervious surface area is development in floodplains. So more and more people are living and developing in known flood zones, and that development is changing the dynamics of the floodplain. And so especially in recent years, we've been seeing flooding occur more frequently in areas that historically were not considered part of the floodplain. So next I want to walk through a few FEMA resources that are good to be aware of and can help you understand your flood risk. So we're going to walk through the Federal Flood Risk Management Standard, how to interpret the flood zone codes, and then the FEMA flood maps. So the Federal Flood Risk Management Standard requires federal agencies to use one of 3 approaches for federally funded projects. So for those project siting, design, and construction decisions to account for future flood risk when they're making decisions. So the climate-informed science approach is the most technical. It uses the best available climate data and hydraulic modeling of an area to calculate very location-specific flood risk. The freeboard value approach and the 500-year floodplain are simpler proxy options to account for changing flood risk. So these might be more appropriate for your sites as you're working through things. But it's important to keep in mind that since these two methods are more of a proxy, they might not be capturing the full risk for any given area. So the freeboard value approach simply adds an additional 2 or 3 feet to the base flood elevation based on a set of criteria, and the 500-year floodplain indicates the area that historically has a 0.2% chance of flooding each year. And this 500-year floodplain should be used over the 100-year floodplain, which has a 1% annual chance of flooding, to capture a larger area at risk of flooding. And as we have noted in the earlier slides, that frequency and intensity of flooding is changing. So that 500-year or 100-year flood, is no longer really occurring on that same timetable. So the guidance here is to use that 500-year floodplain to better account for flood risk. I'm sure many of you have heard of FEMA flood maps, and while these are often used to understand flood hazard information, it's important to remember that these are actually first and foremost flood insurance rate maps that FEMA uses. So they don't actually provide a full picture of flood risk, especially when you factor in the impact of climate change, but they do still provide some useful information as a starting point to understanding your flood risk. So some things to keep in mind are these maps are not forward-looking. They're only reflective of past conditions, and they only capture riverine and coastal flooding. They're not designed to capture urban and flash flooding events, and it's really those urban flash flood events where we're really seeing a change in recent years as storm frequency and intensity change. And FEMA flood maps have a series of different codes to indicate the level of risk. And so we've broken the codes down into a simple cheat sheet here, just based on the first letter of the codes. And so in short, high risk zones, we start with an A or a V, are within the 100-year historic floodplain, and so have a 1% annual chance of flooding historically. And then the low to moderate risk zones represent the area outside of the 100-year zone, but within that 500-year zone that has a 0.2% annual chance of flooding historically. And if you're interested in the details of the different individual codes, we have a breakdown of those in the appendix of this slide deck. So if you're interested in accessing the flood maps for your area, you can go to the FEMA Flood Map Service Center and type in an address, a place, or a set of coordinates. And then you can view or download the digitized maps in the National Flood Hazard Layer Viewer. And so, for example, here we're looking at the flood map for an area in downtown Cincinnati on the Ohio River. And the blue shaded areas represent that 100-year high risk flood zone. And then the additional yellow-orange area is that extra 500-year zone. And if you were then to download this data to GIS, we recommend overlaying your brownfield site boundary with that flood map to see exactly what areas of your site might be within that 100-year or 500-year floodplain. And then last but not least, having grown up near Lake Erie myself, the Great Lakes states also face some unique challenges from climate change along the shores of the Great Lakes. So, for example, we're seeing more variable lake levels and more lake-driven flood events along the shore. And so lake levels are primarily driven by precipitation, runoff, and evaporation. An earlier winter thaw, warmer temperatures, and more frequent heavy rain events are causing those higher lake levels, which then leads to flooding and shoreline erosion. And if you're interested in kind of diving in and trying to visualize what and where those impacts might be along your shoreline, NOAA has the lake level viewer where you can select a Great Lake up at the top and then use the sliding scale on the left here to select different lake level heights and view where the water is going. And there's also a variety of layers that you can toggle on and off to explore some other features as well. So, for example, in the green, you can look at the society layer to see the social vulnerability of those communities along the lakeshore that might be impacted by the higher lake levels and subsequent flooding. Okay, so similar to the heat activity, we are also going to brainstorm some flooding strategies. And so here is just a few examples to get your wheels turning on strategies to reduce flood impacts through brownfield redevelopment. So this could be incorporating green infrastructure features like green roofs, which came up before, is also a good heat strategy. Elevating structures above the floodplain to protect it from flood damage, and using nature-based solutions that help with floodwater storage capacity, such as protecting and expanding a wetland, which can then hold a lot more water and reduce the spread of flooding. And wetlands can also be a good tool for filtering out contaminants as well. So we will now jump to the mural board again. And we just summon everyone over to the flooding side of the board. Going through the same exercise this time, but we have a mixed-use development center photo at the top with some shopping and apartment buildings. And then we also, have a basketball court and a pretty expansive parking lot. And so under the assumption that these two properties are in an area vulnerable to flooding, what kinds of strategies could we implement here to help reduce and protect these? So it looks like we have permeable pavement, which is great in helping reduce that impervious surface area that we talked about. Rain barrels for rainwater collection. Planting native species, bioswales. For the basketball court site, we have plant more plants. Plantings in between the courts. Digging retention areas around the parking lot and other impermeable surfaces and filling that with native vegetation to help with capturing water. I see we have implementing new zoning to restrict building and rebuilding in flood-prone areas. That's a great one too. Can definitely strategies on, purely the planning side that can help prevent development in flood areas. All right. Seems the typing has slowed down. So you can leave this mural up and feel free to add more ideas, but we will transition back to the PowerPoint deck.
All right, so I'll take it from here. So we're hopeful that the tools that we discussed today will be helpful in your efforts to integrate climate resiliency into your work, but we wanted to make sure that everyone was aware of additional technical and financial resources that are available. So I first wanted to mention the 2021 Brownfields Federal Programs Guide, which outlines financial and technical assistance resources provided by federal agencies for brownfields and for land revitalization projects. What I like about this resource is it's categorizes the funding opportunities by the phase of the project for which it can fund. So there's a section for planning, a section for assessment, cleanup, et cetera. And then we also included a link to program updates and new programs that were created under IIJA, otherwise known as Bill, and IRA. And on this slide, we've outlined some additional tools and resource repositories. The first one on the top left is the EPA Cleanup Technology site, or CLUIN. They've got a ton of information on green remediation and sustainable resilient remediation. They have live and recorded webinars, and it's an overall great technical resource. We also have the EPA Adaptation website, which houses the Adaptation Resource Center. And then the US Climate Resilience Toolkit is a repository of tools that you can filter through, including mapping tools to help with assessing climate vulnerabilities and risks, other things that we didn't discuss in detail today.
All right. So we have one more mural activity for all of you. So if we can switch back over to that board, we're going to talk about, the resources and needs that would be useful to all of you. So as you see at the prompt top here, we have the question of what resources and or knowledge would be useful for grantees and applicants when planning for and implementing climate resilience in brownfields development. And, that's divided sort of into these columns here of what data and information, what resources, what connections and partners. And really important as well over at the far end there is how can EPA or other partners help grantees and applicants overcome barriers to climate smart redevelopment? This is your chance to really voice what else you need. Hopefully you got some things out of the training so far today, but what are your lingering questions? What are the lingering resources and information that would be useful moving forward? And, we'll do our best to regroup and think about that and how it could be used. So please get your ideas in here. Think broadly, think expansively, and also use those thumbs up symbols that you see at the top and drag them onto other people's ideas that you want to second and really advocate for some additional thinking about.
Just to reiterate our point here, we designed this workshop with you all in mind. So we want to carry on momentum, and we want to know what else is needed out there. So there's no wrong answer. So it could be, again, data information, resources, connections, partners, anything that you could think of. Don't limit yourself.
Seeing a lot of support for funding resources for green redevelopment, insights on that. Data on historical and projected climate data on the impacts to the site. Success stories from other communities. I think it was great to hear a little bit of that today, but yes, more case studies, more examples. What are some low-cost climate solutions? Certainly, there are a range of costs to these strategies, and being able to say, what are some of those easier to implement solutions and having insights into that makes sense to me. Something very practical here about just how do you even identify and purchase the native fauna, if that is a priority. Sure.
Yes. Also renewable energy. That's also a good one. That's certainly trending at brownfield sites. For example, putting in and installing solar panel farms. Okay.
And this is an opportunity as well. We have a little time. If you feel like this is too small of a sticky note to be able to fully express what you need, if you want to come off mute and share something, then feel free. We're happy to hear a little bit of an expansion about one that you feel particularly passionate about. Don't have time for everyone to speak, but if there's a particular request that you want to put a little more structure behind.
we also understand that everyone's starting at different places in the realm of climate resiliency. So it could be something as simple as, you know, further education outreach on climate smart solutions, or it could be, you know, ways of implementing and adding in things like renewable energy to your redevelopment plans. These are some good ones, though. Analysis of costs associated with climate mitigation tools. This is great, folks. Keep it coming. I love all the thumbs up for funding resources for green redevelopment. Okay, I see a question in the chat too. Are there resources for communities that have no GIS capacity to get EPA resources to get a person to collect data? So I think it depends on the specificity of data requested. However, we do have a select number of staff who are able to assist communities in evaluating publicly available GIS data layers. We certainly have those options as well.
And Sarah, this is not something related to EPA support for it, but there are several opportunities at the regional scale, often for communities to reach out to their regional planning commissions and other organizations that may have more capacity to help on the GIS side, and that's sort of the technical piece that they bring to the table. So think outside of just your city or county limits, but think about other organizations within the region that could support.
That's a great point, Emily. Thank you. And Carol is also mentioning firing up local college students, high school students. They might have, you know, courses tapping into this resource and what their passions are and getting them experience in the meantime as well. Thanks, Anne. All right, I'm curious to hear from folks verbally. Feel free to take yourself off mute. I want to hear from you guys. Looks like we've got several options for next steps and topics to consider. Carrie Cragen, I see your hand is up.
Yes, I was hoping someone could elaborate on when people talk about climate change, they often talk about prevention. And a lot of the resources you put on there are kind of prevention, but they're also resilience and mitigation. They're things that could help buffer the damages. Could you give example, or could anyone give an example of, you know, things that are all of them, or what the difference is between those things a little bit more?
Thank you for that question. ICF folks, any thoughts come to mind?
if I'm following your question, you're talking more about the differences sort of between climate change mitigation, which we consider to be reducing greenhouse gas emissions, versus adaptation, which is more about reducing the impacts of changes in climate. Is that correct?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm asking.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of strategies that can be an overlap between the two. And so those are definitely those sort of win-win items, especially when we talk about things like planting trees or things of that nature. That's going to remove carbon from the atmosphere for obvious reasons, as well as help provide that shading benefits and reducing urban heat island impacts, like we said. But so I think it's important to be thinking about those sorts of co-benefits. Hopefully that example is helpful, but also make sure that we're thinking about solutions that fit more squarely on one side or the other as well. And I'll leave it open to other team members to talk more about any other examples they have that come to mind.
This is Carrie again. Would an example be like doing native landscaping where the roots would, sequester carbon, but it's also great for pollinators and helps reduce urban heat island or helps mitigate stormwater? Are there, when you say co-benefits, is that what you mean? Things that are great all the way around for preventing and for mitigating future impacts?
Yes, exactly. And the example you gave, right, that can also help reduce erosion. So many co-benefits there. Kind of, it's generally tends to be ones that fall more on that green, natural side of the equation that really helps span the two sides of the climate change problem. And I see some comments from Ann Carroll in the chat as well about another benefit about revitalizing and infill brownfield sites. We're reducing the impacts of sprawl development, which helps with mitigation, right? People don't have to drive as far and all the emissions associated with that. But if we also incorporate features then to redevelopment that have adaptation solutions, then you're also providing sites that are safe moving forward. And I think that is something that could be a resource going forward, right? Of just what are the solutions on each side and what is that intersection in order to help point out those win-win solutions. John, I see you have your hand raised.
Might remediation be an example of that? And if it is, I've been searching high and low for phytoremediation funding mechanisms, and there don't seem to be many out there.
Yeah, Brenda, I think I can maybe make a point there, but certainly, John, that that's an example where you're getting co-benefits of both the increased greening, positive impacts, as well as the environmental impacts of the reduced contamination, and probably also the movement of contamination offsite, limited by the plants there. But I will say that it's an emerging technique that people are utilizing. And so when it comes to, real world case studies or examples or funding mechanisms, you're right. I think that we're still sort of putting this out there. But there may be something from your state or other nonprofits actually at the national scale that have been sort of on the more cutting edge on that. And I don't know, Sarah, Jim, or Ashley, if there's anything you guys want to point out from EPA side on the emergence of phytoremediation.
Thanks for that question, John. Within our National Program Office, we are learning more about phytoremediation. I just attended a training not too long ago from some of our other regional staff about their phytoremediation work that they're doing to incorporate within the cleanup process. So it's gaining momentum. I have a flyer here that I could put in the chat for more information. Let's see. And Carol, do you have anything to add on to that? I see you made a comment, but I'm gonna see if you have anything else to say.
Yes, thank you. Hi. John, we are trying to work more closely with the Forest Service. They have a number of different both research stations as well as interest and expertise in trees. And so it's really bringing together the contaminated site people with the tree experts and the vegetation experts. There is a lot of myth out on the internet. And so these are engineered systems and they have to be recognized and treated as engineered systems. But I will be sharing with our Region 5 colleagues, and both our Superfund program and other programs have put together lists of Phyto, and we're trying to actually get that list updated right now. So look forward to some more information on that, and happy to go back on mute and hear other questions.
I don't want to put someone on the spot, but I am looking back at the board. There was someone that requested additional training focused on using the resources. Was that question geared toward the additional EPA resources that we have available? If that person has any, or if anyone else wants to expand upon that, that'd be helpful for us.
Really shy crew today. All right, so if there are no further comments on future needs or anything of that sort, I think we could possibly move forward onto our closing, to our wrap up. Thank you, Brenda, for facilitating that. All right, so we're wrapping up here. So as you can see, we're still in the Mural board, folks. We're wrapping up our time. I know 2 hours is a long time to have you all sit and pay attention and stay engaged, but we still want to get more feedback from you. So again, I encourage you all to take yourself off mute, and I want to hear folks' biggest takeaway from today's workshop. Please put it in the Mural, in the group chat here, or again, just raise your hand. Anything new that you learned, or any tools that you want to dig into more so? Any other opportunities, looking into case studies? I think we want to hear, like, what was today's biggest takeaway? This is great. I'm seeing some responses. All right. Groundwork, Ohio River Valley, yes. All right.
Yeah, and I echo Carrie's comment on heat.gov. I was unaware of that resource until today, so that's great. Yeah, and I definitely think, I mean, like we saw in the previous board, that I think what would be helpful for other communities is to hear from more organizations like Groundwork ORV. So have more presentations like that available for everyone. And Groundwork ORV is great because they work with a lot of different communities. So that can be, we can use them as like a facilitator to bring smaller communities together to work together. So I think that's a great comment.
Certainly. Okay. Planning for climate change is needed in all our projects. This is so true. It's an overarching issue that we have to be considerate. Okay. Thank you, Eric, for your comment in the chat. The City of Detroit Phyto pilot project. All right.
Eric, can I put you on the spot to make a plug for the Brownfields conference?
Yeah.
Just getting my mic ready and camera. Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Eric Knapke. I am the regional contact for the 2023 Brownfields conference happening in Detroit in August. So right now we just closed out our call for ideas. We've got a lot of submissions for sessions at the conference, and a lot of them are focused on climate change strategies, adaptation, mitigation, resiliency, all that stuff. So it should be a huge part of the conference. It'll be August 8th through 11th in Detroit. And yeah, we're working on it behind the scenes to get it ready to go. It should be a really great conference. We've had a lot of engagement so far, so it should be really excellent. I'll put the conference website in the chat. Thanks, Ashley.
Thanks, Eric. Yeah, and I feel like the conference is a great opportunity to make additional connections between communities, come up with a coalition. So hopefully that'll be another opportunity for everyone to collaborate. Yes, Jim.
This is back to the phytoremediation question, and the brain's been working on that since the question was posed. There are a number of different types of phytoremediation, and one of them involves the control of flow of water and flow of water through the ground. And if we have increased precipitation, there can be problems with contaminated sites where they're pump and treat systems, and planting trees around them can help to control the flow. Trees are also important components of control of vehicular emissions in urban areas. And so there are US Forest Service funds, I believe, available for tree planting in some situations. So for that particular type of green infrastructure, and that which green infrastructure as an example of phytoremediation, there may be funding available for implementation. You can combine several issues together. So.
Thanks, Jim.
Awesome. Thanks.
Beth Grigsby also made a comment in the chat with regards to KSU TAB, Kansas State University, also provides technical assistance here in Region 5. We have Beth notes that they have several partners that focus on climate resilience, and they are also a free resource provided by the EPA. So we'll be certainly providing some information with regards to tapping into that resource as well. Thank you, Beth.
Yeah, Beth, did you want to expand at all on what resources KSU TAB can provide to communities? I think a lot of communities aren't even aware of this resource.
Sure. We provide a lot of the basic brownfield services like inventory, visioning of a site. Let's say you are considering some sort of mitigation or resilience planning for a site, but you're not quite sure how you're going to use that property. That's something and then we provide architectural drawings for you so that you kind of frame that into a picture. We provide marketing and economic development type of planning and reports. When it comes to the climate and resiliencies, we are really gearing up for climate control. We have several universities that will be our partners, as well as other pretty well-known climate professionals. And they're all over the nation, but we've brought them in under our contract. So I think it's just a matter of giving us a call. I'll put my number in the chat for you, but definitely have a lot of services that we can offer to communities.
Great, thank you, Beth. And KSU can also assist with the grant application process. So.
Oh, right, and that's one reason why I'm on this, and it was so well organized. I just was really impressed, because the information you're providing today will be information that we will definitely be sharing. We're going to do a webinar series on the MARC grant where we actually start at the beginning. Do you have the capacity to even, manage a grant? And if you don't, what do you do? How do you work through that? And then all the way through the grant criteria, You know, so stay tuned. We haven't exactly gotten the dates out yet, but we expect that to start in April.
Awesome, great.
All right. Let's see here. If there are no other remarks regarding today's takeaway, I guess my last question is with regards to the time, the level of content, looking at, you know, the depth that we went into with certain tools, would you change anything about, you know, either of those factors as we wrap up here and contemplate future trainings? Any other remaining thoughts on there, we also welcome and appreciate, again, through the Mural, the chat, or just telling us verbally. We so appreciate ICF and the expertise they brought to Region 5 today, taking deep dives into things like, you know, the FEMA flood zones, you know, what climate change impacts we're experiencing here in the Great Lakes states. And we're really looking forward to the next training that we're able to put on. So, all right, very good information, great workshop. Okay, all right. We were also really interested to see what Mural was like. I had never used Mural, and I don't think Ashley had either prior to that. So we wanted to make sure this was engaging for you all because, again, it's a long time to just sit and listen. So we want to make this as interactive as possible, given that we're not in person. So, okay. All righty then.
Yeah, feel free to keep entering your comments in. We'll pull up the last slide eventually with my contact information. If you have any further feedback for us, future ideas on trainings, etc., feel free to reach out. Happy to chat. So we know we can't cover everything in one workshop, so the feedback you provided all of us will be helpful in future opportunities that we have like this. So thank you again for everyone for sticking through the 2 hours with us. We really appreciate your time. And I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day.
Wonderful. Thanks again, folks. And thank you again to Groundwork ORV. Tiffany
Yes,
Harvey, it was a
thanks,
pleasure
Tiffany.
having you. And I hope you realize that you were a hit. So thanks again, everyone. We
Thank you.
appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Region 5, for hosting this. You did a great job, all, and thanks for attending.
Thanks, folks. Looks like we have a hand up. Was Vishva Patel? Maybe it was just a mistake. Okay.
Sorry, that was an accident.
No worries. Happens to the best of us. All right, folks. Thanks again.